Madam President, the bill before the Senate this week is not really about COVID relief. It's about politics. Before this, COVID relief has not been a terribly partisan issue. In fact, we've passed 5 relief bills, each with at least 90 votes. So these are overwhelmingly broad-based and bipartisan efforts. So if this one were to pass, it would be the first of those to have passed that's been highly controversial. Why? Well, because in the first place, it borrows and spends another $1.9 trillion when there are still hundreds of billions of dollars of unspent relief money from past COVID-19 relief packages. And the new spending authorizes money to go to projects in states and local governments, including many that may not even need it. The fight against the pandemic has, of course, fundamentally changed in the months since this plan was first devised and proposed. It's already outdated. Now, as we are here into the month of March, the circumstances have changed. And yet the plan remains largely the same as it was. And so it feels a little bit to me like we're fighting the last war, using the last war's battle plan, leaving us unprepared for the battle actually in front of us. This is a bill that will worsen our national debt and weaken our economy in the long run, without even doing much to help small businesses and American families in the short term. This is not without consequence. In fact, as the book by Drs. Reinhardt and Rogoff, published nearly 10 years ago, a book known as This Time It's Different, notes, once we get into this cycle, once we get accustomed to spending this much and acquiring this much of a debt to GDP ratio, we find ourselves in dire circumstances, circumstances in which it's even more difficult to raise the same revenue based on the same tax structure, or even while tweaking that tax structure. It can be very difficult to pull out of the tailspin that can be produced when we start spending in sums this large and perpetuating a debt to GDP ratio that is frankly unsustainable. This $1.9 trillion package has very, very little to do with COVID. In fact, only 1% of the spending in this bill will go toward accelerating vaccine distribution. Just 5% is focused on public health. Instead, according to the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, 3 times as much money will go toward partisan priorities that are, quote, not directly related to the current crisis, close quote. So what are some of the examples of this type of spending? Well, we've got $1.5 billion more set aside for Amtrak, which is itself already sitting on $1 billion of unspent bailout money. Now, what this has to do with the virus and why the virus somehow justifies giving them an additional $1.5 billion when they're already sitting on $1 billion of still unspent bailout money is beyond my comprehension. $50 million in funding for environmental justice projects. Also difficult to connect that up to COVID. $200 million for the Institute of Museum and Library Services. $135 million for the National Endowment for the Arts. $135 million for the National Endowment for the Humanities. $86 billion in a pension bailout for private sector workers. The list goes on, but you get the idea. You've got money that goes to projects as well as a significant amount to state and local governments. We'll get back to that in a moment. When there's as much as $63 billion left over in unspent funds. And this money will not necessarily even help schools to reopen. $350 billion in aid goes to state and local governments, even though total losses to date have mostly been covered by the $360 billion that Congress has already provided in aid for state and local governments over the last year. While there's some disparity among and between the states and how they've responded to the COVID pandemic and how they've fared as far as their revenues, state and local revenue has mostly recovered. And while 26 states saw general revenue declines, 21 states actually saw revenue gains. In fact, in my home state of Utah, as well as some other states, they're running surpluses. Utah's sacrifice and good governance should not go to bail out other profligate states to the tune of $350 billion. I think about hardworking moms and dads in Utah struggling to make ends meet while paying their federal and state taxes. They're told over and over and over again that they've got to be giving more. They're told that what they have spent and the time they've allotted, weeks or months out of every year just to pay their federal taxes alone, still somehow isn't enough, isn't nearly enough, because in addition to the money that they've worked so hard to earn and give to the federal government, there's so much more that has to be spent, like $1.5 billion going to Amtrak, even though it's already sitting on $1 billion of unspent bailout relief. These same moms and dads throughout Utah are not pleased when they're made to understand that in addition to bailing out Amtrak again, when Amtrak's already sitting on this $1 billion in unspent bailout relief money, that they're also going to have to bail out other states, that they're going to have to bail out state and local governments that haven't been managed well as Utah's government has. This isn't fair to them. This is a matter of fundamental fairness to them and to countless Americans, not only in Utah, but in every state. And some states still have unspent funding that they've gotten from previous COVID relief packages. California alone has $8 billion in unspent funding. And New York has up to $5 billion. In this bill, we're acting like states are facing a fiscal catastrophe that is specifically from COVID, when they're not. At the same time, we're acting like the unprecedented magnitude of federal debt is a non-issue. It is not. We've got this situation exactly backwards. Now, look, any new relief funding just needs to be targeted, and it needs to be temporary. And it needs to be directly tied to COVID relief. This package is instead about fulfilling the political wish list of one political party over another and has very little, if anything, to do with the pandemic. It's offensive. And yes, it's inappropriate. For one political party, the political party that clings to the narrowest of margins of a majority in this body, to push its own political wish list onto an opportunity to provide COVID relief for the American people. And it would be equally inappropriate for Republicans to use it as an opportunity to push their own wish list. Look, we haven't seen this before. We haven't seen anything like this before. We didn't in the past see any of the previous COVID relief packages pushed through reconciliation. There are a number of reasons for that, one of which was it's wrong. It's not an appropriate use of reconciliation. Another was it wasn't necessary because we made it bipartisan. Not just mildly bipartisan with a few straggler votes here or there, but overwhelmingly so. This one is different. I'm not opposed to discussing what role government should play in providing actual relief from the pandemic. We can and should have that debate. I welcome it. I'd love to have it right now. In fact, that is a question that I think merits its own debate. This bill is not about that, not anything close to that. It's riddled with poor economic reasoning and rank political favoritism. It'll only worsen our debt and our economic health in the long run. It doesn't help American small businesses and families in the short run. It doesn't do anything to materially advance the cause of getting our children back to school at a time when they've suffered so greatly, not only academically, but socially and in so many other ways. That's where we ought to be focused. This bill comes nowhere close to addressing that issue, and instead, it directs itself in other directions that are not only not helpful, but in many cases, they're the opposite of that. It's sad, it's disappointing, and on that basis, I can't support this bill, but would urge my colleagues to figure out ways to make it better. We don't have to do it this way. It doesn't have to be a deeply partisan vote. We can still choose a different path. I, for one, hope we will. Thank you, Madam President.